Oh, excuse. Well, isn't it nice to have heat? Do what? How about? All right, just a few announcements before I begin. If I missed you, there's handouts on between the red chairs in the back or on the front two pews. If I didn't catch you when you came in, pardon? How about now? How about now? Now? Can you give me a little more volume, Tim? How about now? Okay. All righty. Thanks, Tim. Just a few announcements before we begin. Gentlemen, remember tomorrow morning, men's breakfast, 6:30. And we got heat. We got a stove that works. It's going to be good. Remember the Glenview Elementary Christmas boxes continue to bring food items for the school. Each will contain a number of food items to help families with food needs during the Christmas holidays. And there's a list on our Facebook page and on a table in the back of the auditorium. And we're going to pile the pulpit, and we've started already. So bring your items on and drop them off on the stage. If you got any questions, you can contact someone here at the office. And you can also donate money or a Walmart gift card if you'd rather do that. We're needing one more helper in pre-K. If you can help with that, if you could contact Carolyn Prestridge. And Deborah, I heard you got someone to, where is Deborah? Oh, she must have gone to the ladies' class. But I heard that she got someone to take, John. So she was looking for someone to take her dad to a luncheon deal, but John volunteered. Ladies gift exchange will be, I think it's this Saturday. Yes, this Saturday at 6 o'clock. Bring a finger food to share and a $10 or more wrapped gift to share. If you have contacts, you can contact Patsy Jewell. Patsy, is it here? Party? Oh, okay. Okay, but heavy on the dirty Santa business, right? Okay. All righty. Summers Kids Christmas lunch and Glenview box service. All Summers kids and families are invited to a Christmas lunch and service project after services on Sunday the 15th. We will have a TBA lunch. I don't know what that means, so don't ask me. I don't. To be in. Thank you. You know, it's been a while since I had my coffee this morning, so anyway, this will be in the activity center, and there'll be a time to decorate the food boxes and some fellowship. We need to remember Nina Hames. She's doing better. She had pneumonia, but she's at home, still having to stay in. Joe Ellis had his dialysis port placed the 2nd. Procedure went well. He's awake. He's sore. They're going to keep him in the hospital for a couple of days just to make sure everything goes right, and then he'll be discharged home. I know at one time they were talking about rehab, but he seems to be doing better. Gil Myatt had surgery 2 weeks ago on his hand to relieve some infection. And Cecily Story is home from the hospital. If you remember Sunday, she was in ICU. And if there's any other announcements, they'll be on the Facebook page. So we're going to be covering Hebrews this quarter. And as we go through, there's a few things I really want us on this quarter to really think about what it felt like to be a Hebrew Christian in the first century. That's going to be in the back of my mind all through this quarter. So who was the author? There's a lot of discussion. You can read 15 commentaries and get 15 opinions. There's 3 that I rely on heavily. I think they're kind of set the standard for being true, and that's the Truth for Today commentary, the Gospel Advocate commentary, and the Burton Kaufman commentary. They're all members of the church that write those. It's various authors on the Truth for Today. I like Truth for Today because it's a newer commentary, and so if there's any data from archaeology, they'll be able to include that. Martel Pace, who authored the Truth for Today commentary on Hebrews, said there's evidence that Apollos, Barnabas, or Paul, but he leaned toward Paul, as did the Gospel Advocate commentary, Robert Milligan, and then Burton Kaufman. And they all three agree that somewhere between 63 AD and 70 AD was the time that the letter was written. What is significant about AD 70? Destruction of the temple. And so in those last 7 years, Paul is in prison. Others were tortured. Paul is executed sometime around this time period. He's in prison once, released, and then back to prison with Nero and his insanity, and executed during this time. So the purpose of the book, I've shared with you Burton Kaufman's assessment. I think it's pretty good. It's just, you've got Christians who are dealing with the world, and I identify that. We are Christians dealing with the world as it is. We can't control the world, but we deal with it. My son has a phrase that he says, you can't run the show, you work the system. And that's true to a certain extent. We don't run the show, but we have to live in it. And so these Jewish Christians are having to live in it, and it's not so great. And there was a lot of hoopla when the church was established. There was hoopla, if you want to call it that, while Jesus was in his ministry on earth with the miracles, and then the miracles around the day of Pentecost, and those things going on, and then things gradually settled down. So we're about 30, 35 years after the establishment of the church. And so the new has kind of worn off. It's not new anymore. And if you've ever been around a business that's just getting started, or opened a new department, or in a new house, or anything, after a while the new wears off. Well, in my mind, the new has worn off, and now they're dealing with the everyday stuff. For us, we have to deal with everyday culture just like they're doing. This world that we live in, including our United States, if you compare what our moral standards should be, we are in direct contradiction of what the morals of our community and the morals of our nation, and most certainly the world. And I'm not talking about being concerned about Islam and Hinduism. I'm just talking about just day-to-day people. The marriage vows are irrelevant. 50% of marriages, people enter into marriage, think, well, if it doesn't work out. That is diametrically opposed to the teachings of Jesus. That's not the way we live. People's moral standards are not the same as ours, and we have to deal with that. There's probably more liquor stores in North Little Rock than there are church buildings if you added up all the church buildings of all kinds in the city. There's probably more liquor stores. It's just the way things are, and we have to deal with that. So we can identify with that in some way. The Roman world that Paul dealt with, and Paul is talking about, anywhere, this is on your handout, anywhere from 30 to 50% of the people in the Roman Empire were slaves, and it just depends on who you read. But that's a lot. Here in our country, we don't have slavery, so we don't have to deal with that. But 30 to 50%. Oddly enough, women had more rights in the Roman Empire than other parts of the world at the time. For example, women could own property and they could divorce their husbands, which was really unheard of in the first century in other places. But it was full of paganism. You think about, every one of us read Greek mythology when we were in high school. I did, and the Roman mythology, and all, they worshipped all the planets and the sun and the moon and the stars and the river and And so there was paganism, and you know, an example of that is when Paul was in Athens in Acts chapter 17. There were so many idols, and they wanted to be sure they didn't leave anybody out. There was one to the unknown God, and Paul made that the focus of his sermon. Just a quick reminder, there's a few people who are joining us online, so any comments that are made I'm going to repeat so that they can hear what you say too. Probably the worst of the worst was the fact that Nero was in charge. He was in charge of the Roman Empire. And if you think our politics are crazy, they are. Our politics are crazy. And it's really not anything we want to deal with. But you got Nero. His mother was Julia Agrippina. I don't know if I said that or time. His dad died when he was 3, and she poisoned her second husband, and then married her uncle, and then after she arranged the murder of his wife. So he murdered his future husband's wife so that she could get married to him. And then she had Nero marry her daughter, and then guess what she did then next? Had those murdered so that Nero could be emperor. That was really not that uncommon for succession of leadership in this part of the world and this time being. You know, if you, it would be common for the eldest son to ascend the throne and kill all of his siblings because he doesn't want any competition. That was not all that uncommon. And if there was anybody left from the previous king, he'd kill them too, because you don't want anybody, you don't want the people looking at them saying, well, you know, they might do better. So it happened frequently, and Nero and his crazy mother participated in that fully. So anyway, so he was appointed the emperor when he was 17 years old in AD 54. And it kind of went downhill from then. So we are familiar with the persecution under Nero. We've heard the stories and seen all that. And it started in earnest about AD 64 after what event? What happened? What kicked off the persecution for the church? The fire. The fire of Rome. You got to blame somebody. And the Christians were a good person. Ernest, did you have your hand up? Yes. No, and we may not ever know. I don't know if we'll get, you know, sometimes history is just what lie we've all agreed to. So, because it's hard sometimes to go back and figure out what the truth was. So the persecution began in AD 64. Somewhere in there, Paul's in prison the first time, and then he gets called back to prison and executed shortly thereafter. So this is going on. Christians were often very misunderstood. You got a pagan community that they live in. Paganism is really the order of the day. And if you remember when Paul was in prison in the last chapter of Acts, Acts 28, and he was in prison, and the Jews came to hear him, and they said in Acts 28:22, we want to hear about this sect you're in. This was a sect to them. We know that it is spoken against everywhere. That was the attitude of the people in this particular time, especially the Jews. They were accused of being cannibals because they considered in taking of the Lord's Supper the body and the blood of Christ. They were accused of incest, due to loving their brothers and sisters. They were labeled atheists because they didn't believe in all these gods. They just believed in one God, but they were sometimes called atheists. And it made them easy targets. And Paul, as a well-known Christian leader of the time, was a good target. You eliminate those who might cause you trouble in this day and time, and that's what they did. One of my favorite quotes of all time in history is Voltaire. It is dangerous to be right when the established authorities are wrong. And Paul was teaching and preaching what is right against the established authorities, saying there's one God, and especially we know the Jews had a problem with him. And so they were behind a lot of this stuff that causes execution. So that's what he's dealing with, and that's the background. So as we go through this study, this is the approach I want to take. These Christians are dealing with change. The church has only been established 30-something years. So the vast majority of them are what we would call converts, right? They hadn't had a lot of time to have kids and raise them in the church like many of us. Both of my parents were members of the church. I was raised in the church. I was always exposed to the church. My mother and dad took me to Bible class when I was old enough to go as a baby. And many of you were in that. So, but these people were not. They are what we would call, in some cases, new converts. And so they're dealing with all of that. They've had immense challenges that they've had to deal with. They have been taught for generations that they were special. And that what was their attitude towards the Gentiles, which was everybody else? What was their attitude? They were not special. Right. Gentiles were unclean. You weren't supposed to be around them, and you couldn't be around them close to any special holiday or feast day or anything, because you'd be unclean. They were, and you know, I sympathize with that. That's what they were taught. You know, we've seen, this is probably not a great example, but we've seen kids that their mama raised them and their daddy raised them and told them they was special their whole life, and then they get 18, they got to make their own way, and they realize they're not so special anymore. You know, not everybody thinks that little princess is a princess anymore. Go to work. I expect you to be on time. Well, daddy never made me. Well, guess what? These are people that have had to face that they are not that special, and they have to love the Gentiles that are coming into the church, the unclean, dirty Gentiles. And they're supposed to love and fellowship them. Yes?
We have a God, you know, and they did.
Exactly. The text of the New Testament had not been fully distributed by this time. And so they're having to, and so that was part, and we'll mention this a little bit later in the second chapter. The purpose of the miracles and the Holy Spirit was to have them a basis to be taught by. But you're exactly right, Melba. So they also were expecting a physical kingdom. They were expecting Jesus, if he was really the Messiah, he was going to come in and get rid of these Romans, because he was going to be the Savior. He was going to get rid of them. And Jesus himself told Pilate, and he told others, my kingdom is what? Not of this world. And he said it and said it and said it. And then what did the apostles say to him right before he ascended in Acts chapter 1? What question did they ask him? You going to restore the kingdom now? So, I mean, right before the day of Pentecost, they're still asking. So, I'll be earnest.
Well, a guy had a plan what he's going to get rid of when he's going to convert Christianity.
Uh-huh.
And get rid of it. Get rid of the Roman.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that would be, yes, that would have. Anyway, so despite Jesus saying that, then he gets executed. You know, they saw the miracles, feeding the 5,000, healing the blind, raising the dead, all of that, and then he's dead. And they're going, what now? But when he died, think about everything that happened when Jesus died. And these are documented in Matthew 27. In verse 51, the veil of the temple was torn from top to bottom. The earth shook, rocks split, tombs were opened, and saints rose up and went out and talked to people. All those miraculous things. And then the day of Pentecost, 50 days later. All these people are in Jerusalem. And tongues of fire and a rushing wind, and they're unbelievable that everybody is hearing them speaking in their native language. And so in Acts chapter 2 and verse 6 says they were bewildered with this. And they even accused them of being drunk. Peter had said, it's only 9 in the morning, a little early. But so they deal that. And then Jesus had been saying, the apostles were saying, he was going to come back. And then he didn't come back when they thought he was going to come back. And Paul had to deal with that. It's like to the Thessalonians, he had to teach that. So, there's doubt. Was this man Jesus? Was he really the guy? Was he really? And so Paul goes to the Old Testament. Well, I'm going to say Paul. We don't know that for 100%, but I kind of lean with Martel Pace that Paul goes back to the Old Testament and starts going through and explaining from the Old Testament, which they were familiar with. They knew the Old Testament. They had scrolls. They had copies of that. And so he starts there and going through. So personally, I sympathize with these Jews. I do. I sympathize with them. They really lost their identity that they were familiar with, that they had been taught for centuries. And they could go back and talk about Mount Sinai and Moses and Jeremiah and these prophets and the things that they did, Elijah. And they could point to that and say, I came from that. And so they've lost that because now Peter and the other apostles are saying it's a different kingdom. You got to do things different. You got to love these Gentiles. Ernest.
Well, the Jews, they were supposed to be in the royal priesthood, weren't they?
Yes.
I assume convert. Weren't they for God? They didn't do that.
Well, I could go on and on about this particular question, but I'll be brief. God was concerned about the Gentile nations. Elijah and Elisha worked among the Gentile nations. Was it Nahum that worked? Was it Nahum that spent some time with Gentile nations? Pardon? Nehemiah? Jonah? Jonah was sent to Nineveh. Pardon? Yes. Yeah, we don't. But God had something to say to Nineveh. And he had sent Jonah there. So, yes, God was concerned about the Gentile nations. But they weren't the chosen race from which the lineage of the Christ was to come. And in Deuteronomy, when Moses is talking to the Israelites, it's not just the Jews then, it's all of the tribes. He told them, God didn't pick you because you were special. He picked you because he made a promise to who? Abraham. He promised Abraham that this was going to happen. You're not that special. But they didn't really get it. So I sympathize with them. They've been taught, they've been raised a certain way, and so they lost friends. They probably lost family, and so they had to get a new circle of friends. And some of them were Gentiles, and some of them were slaves, and some of them were people they didn't really think they should be associating with. That's who their new circle of friends was. So it's a big adjustment. So I really sympathize with them. I feel for them on this. Maybe I shouldn't, but I do. And then now they're being persecuted. because of their differences. So they're dealing with all that. So that's going to be the perspective that I'm going through as we go through Hebrews, that Paul, I believe, is explaining to them why this is special. This is more important. This is better. Better promises. A better priest. Better reward. He's got to go through and explain this. So next you see the outline. Now this outline may be kind of fluid. I've kind of drafted this out. December 25th, we won't have class that week. So I put that as a blank, and then you'll see at the end, toward the next to the last, I just left a blank spot because I feel like somewhere we're going to get off track on something that we want to spend more time on. So I wanted to allow that. And of course, the last Wednesday night of the quarter, we have congregational singing. So that's the outline. All right, so we're 30 years out, 35 years out. Paul is sitting down to write this letter, or dictating it to Luke, as some think. And let me back up just a little bit as far as the authors go. One of the theories is that Paul dictated to Luke, and that he purposely did not want his name in the letter. That, so often he said, "I'm Paul, I'm Paul, an apostle," and or he signed off, and he purposely did not on this letter. Why would you think he might choose to do that on this particular letter? You can speculate, because these authors of these commentaries certainly speculated, so it's okay to speculate a little bit as long as we understand we're guessing and we're speculating. But why might you think that he would not want his name necessarily associated this when it goes out to all these Hebrew Christians?
We don't have to discuss his persecution of the church before he ever got this one.
That's one reason. Why else?
Already getting in trouble, going to prison and everything, and if they got caught with something with his name on it, that is association.
Am I doing that? Can't let me out anywhere. Right, so for the benefit of those, they don't want to be caught carrying a letter around that he wrote, because he's not the most popular guy right now. What else? Anything else? He's not. That's another, to me, that kind of stood out. He's not, among many Jews, he's not very popular. He started out great as far as the Jews was concerned. He was persecuting the church, and it's going great. And then he flipped allegiances, so he's not the most popular guy. Right. So those are some things you might have in the back of your mind. All right. Repeat what you said, George.
I said that prophets, he didn't want to deal with having to explain his persecution of the church before this point.
He didn't want to explain his past. Yeah. All righty. Anything else before we move on? Okay. So he starts the first 4 verses. One thing to think about too as we go through here, it's human nature. People want a leader. They need a leader. They need someone to follow. In every organization that man has ever formed, mankind has elected, selected, some process, someone to lead that group, someone to look up to kind of set the stage. And that's one of the things that Paul is doing here, is saying, you got a leader. You have a leader, and this is him, and this is why he's qualified. And so he starts out here, first 4 verses. And I'll be reading from the New American Standard. God, after he spoke long ago to the fathers in the prophets in many portions and in many ways, in these last days has spoken to us in his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, through whom also he made the world, and he is the radiance of his glory, the exact representation of his nature, upholds all things by the word of his power, And when he had made purification of sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high, having become so much better than angels, as he has inherited a more excellent name than they. So the very first word is God. Why do you think Paul started the way that he started? Again, we're speculating, and it's fine. Why do you think he started in this particular manner? What's one of the basic fundamental things to do when we start to teach someone something they may not be fully aware of, fully comprehend, whatever, however you want to word that? What's one of the things you got to do?
Establish the authority.
Well, that. What else? Start at the beginning, establish the authority, and start with what they know, with what they already accept. These are God-fearing, God-believing people. And so he's got to establish authority. He's got to tell them, here it is. And so he starts out with what they are already going to accept. He doesn't start out and say, you dummies, why did you crucify Jesus? He doesn't start out that way. He starts out with what they know. What came to mind here was other similar passages. John chapter 1, another one of my favorites. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. And then Genesis 1, in the beginning what? God. Again, establishing the authority. So he begins, why does he mention the prophets? Again, why does he go back and mention the prophets? Yes. And who carried God's message before Jesus? The prophets. They were his messengers. They were the ones who established authority, and they taught the people and performed miracles. I mean, you think about some of the prophets, and one of them, Nathan. You got to go tell the king you can't do what you just did. These were brave individuals to go into David and say, you murdered this guy, you're having a woman you can't have, and he is the most powerful guy in the nation, but yet you're going to walk in there and tell him that. Those are the kind of character that they had, that these prophets had. Jeremiah was thrown into a pit. The things that they went through. Chad, did you have your hand up? No? Okay. So, it's a good transition. They understand the prophets. They know the prophets. And what were they told about Elijah? What were they told about Elijah in the New? What thing was associated with John the Baptist? He was what? The Elijah to come. And so they were familiar with that. And Jesus reminded them, and Elijah said, I'm not the Messiah. I'm not him. So they're familiar with these things. So then he starts with some descriptions. First off, he calls him son. That's important, especially to Old Testament believing people. The eldest son got what? Double portion. The eldest son got a double portion of the inheritance and was then also the de facto leader of the family at the death of his father. So the firstborn son was critical to them, and so he goes right to that. When Mary was visited by the angel told her, the Holy Spirit will come upon you, the power of the Most High will overshadow you, and for that reason the Holy Child shall be called the Son of God. So from the beginning, Mary was told, this was what she was told. You're going to have this child, and he is going to be called the Son of God. In Acts 13, Paul reciting some of this also. He's fulfilled his promise in verse 33 to our children that he raised up Jesus, is also written in the second Psalm, "You are my son." This is God speaking this. So it's important. It's important to establish that. The parable of the landowner. When I was reading through this and preparing for this, I thought I really went straight to the parable of the landowner. And remember, this parable is given in Matthew 21. And remember, there's a landowner, and he leaves some people to take care of his vineyard. And at the harvest time, he sends some slaves to collect the crops. What happens to those slaves? And they beat up some, kill some. Send another group of slaves. What happened to them? Same thing. He sent his son. What happened to his son in this parable? Killed him. And so, what did Jesus say then? The landowner took care of business after that, because they rejected his slaves and rejected his son. And he said their end would be wretched, in the language of the New American Standard. The Jews who were listening to that, they did not miss the application. They did not miss it at all. They wanted to throw Jesus off the cliff because they knew exactly what he was saying. Who are the slaves that the landowner sent? The prophets. And of course we know the son. Who's the landowner then? God. So he sent his prophets, they beat some of them up, they killed some of them, sent his son, they killed him, thought they had it made, and then the landowner came and wreaked vengeance on them. This is the authority of the Son. This is how important he is. The heir of all things. In Ephesians chapter 1, verse 21, far and above and rule and authority and power and dominion in every name that is named, not only in this age but the one to come, he put all things in subjection under his feet, speaking of Jesus, and gave him as head over all things to the church, which is his body. So what is left out? What is not under Jesus' dominion? Nothing. Everything is. Jesus himself even said when he was about to depart in Matthew 28, he said, all authority has been given to me. All authority has been given. And then in verse 2 it continues, through him he also made the world. So Jesus was part of the creation. And John chapter 1 reaffirms that. So the last days, this gets people, they go everywhere here with the last days. Because Paul is saying, but in these last days, he's spoken to us by his Son. So what are the last days? It's very clear. If you read the New Testament with an open mind, it's very clear what the last days are. 1 Peter 1, verse 20, for he was foreknown before the foundation of the world, but has appeared in these last times. What did Peter say on the day of Pentecost? The people are seeing all of this going on. What did he say about that prophet Joel? What did he say? This is what Joel was talking about, that would happen in the last days. For us, I would think that it should have been easy for the Jews because they had thousands of years of history behind them. But they seemed to struggle with this, that Jesus hadn't come back as soon as they thought. For us that have been raised in the church, I've been told my entire life that how long's a day to the Lord? 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is a day. That was beat into my head from an early age. And probably anybody who was raised in church that their mom and daddy took them to Bible class, as they should have, learned that lesson. So we get it. but they didn't have it yet. They didn't get it yet. And there's people today who make all kinds of statements about the last days. And yes.
Okay, if the Jews know that their actions caused Jesus to be killed, what did they think about it when God didn't punish them for doing what he punished them? You know, destroy them for killing Jesus, but he did good. Now they got to say, you got to say, we killed him, we had Jesus killed. She's not punished.
What was one of the things that Jesus said on the cross? And forgive them. So that is the primary reason why. Now, me and my mother had this discussion many times. She felt like that all the things that have happened to the Jews over the last 2,000 years are as a result of them rejecting the Christ. She believed, I mean, she was adamant. If you knew my mother, she was.
I went to church with the lady that she's like, Holocaust. That they're still getting
There are people that say that, and there's if you go back to Deuteronomy 28:29, Moses was pretty explicit about what was going to happen to them if they were disobedient, and it was pretty ugly. It's pretty bad. It's bad as it gets. I don't know. We can speculate on all that, but continuing to reject the Christ is ultimately going to cost us our soul, and that's the thing we need to zero in on. Jesus forgave and didn't want that to be held against him. Stephen, what did Stephen say right before he died? Forgive them. That is the attitude of the Christian. And if you can say that at the time that you are being executed by a bunch of angry whoever, then you have reached where you need to be as a righteous, godly person, to care more about that person's soul than vengeance. Because in Romans 12, who did God say was going to exact vengeance? Him. He said, I will. You get along with everybody. I'll do the vengeance, and I'll do that. Because we know he's going to be a righteous judge on that. And so, the latter part in the last few minutes we've got, his credentials, he made everything. He's the radiance of God's glory, which means you see him, you see God. The exact representation, the same essence. He upholds the world by his word, by Jesus' word. And he was there at the creation, and through his word, the worlds were created. He made purification for sins. He paid for us. We are not our own, because what? Paul told us we are what? Bought with a price. Yes. So we are not our own. I just want to point this out. The verbiage, it says he's spoken to us in his Son. And I find that that's the way the New American Standard translates that phrase. The New King James and the New International both say, by his Son. You want to speculate on what the differences or why they might have gone in one direction or the other on that? Anybody? Your opinion is as good as anybody's. Yes, correct. What do you think he meant when the translators of the New American Standard said, in his Son? He's spoken to us in his Son. What do you think what is the connotation of that? What does that say to you? Yes? What did Jesus say? The Father and I are one. And if we have been baptized into Christ, we are one. And Jesus told the Jews there, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father.
So the King James said by his son.
By his, yes.
What about that?
That's just the New King James did that, and the New International, and the English Standard says by his son. I don't want to cut off. So, Tim.
Well, the Greek and Hebrew prepositions for in can also be instrumental. In other words, they can be by something. Someone does something by something. And when it comes to in, yeah, he's speaking in the person of the prophets, he's speaking in the person of the Son, but it could also be by. And given that he says in the prophets, God's relation to the prophets is not the same as the Son.
Correct.
I don't know the emphasis to be put on the preposition. It's on the difference between speaking in or by the prophets and in or
By the Son, yes. I'm with you on that, Tim. I'm not sure we should make a lot out of that. I just thought it was interesting, and I think it emphasizing that if the Son spoke, it's the same as the Father speaking. It's the same weight. It's the same power. It's the same. And
contextually, that's the point he's making.
exactly.
Jesus has a relation to the Father as Son that no other human being or divine being has.
Exactly. And then as we get into next week's lesson, Paul's going to start showing all these other things that Jesus is superior to because of his relationship to the Father. So, yes.
I don't want to get too heavy into semantics here, but does that make us understand it any less because one's in him, one's in God?
Now, this is purely personal on my part, okay? To me, it's heavier to say in his Son. It's more authoritative. But again, different words mean different things to people. And you talk about translating from one language to another, I don't know. It just, to me, it just seems to be a heavier statement when you say in his Son. To me, it's meaning you've heard him, if you heard him speak, you heard me speak. It's not like, to me, the prophets, I told the prophet, you go say this. And there's probably not a nickel's difference in the meaning and the importance of that, because if Jeremiah spoke and you didn't do what you were gonna be punished. But again, that is purely my opinion I'm giving you there. Debbie. Yes. Yes. Yes, totally different. And again, trying to show the Jews how important Jesus is, and for us to remember how important Jesus is. We're in a kingdom. It's not a republic. It's not a democracy. There is a king. Yes. Yes. I think it's in Burton Kaufman's commentary talking about the destruction of the temple. He said he felt like God had to do it. He had to get rid of all this Old Testament stuff, and the temple was such a symbol that he saw to it that it was eliminated. And what stands there now? A mosque. And I don't think in our lifetime or our next lifetime anybody's going to tear that thing down and put a temple back there. Not unless we're ready for World War III, but anyway. I really appreciate the comments and thoughts everyone has shared. I'm really looking forward to this study. I think it's going to be a great study. Hebrews and John are my two favorite New Testament books, so I appreciate you sharing with me. Thank you.